Hello, everyone. My name is Alistair Ballantyne, and you are listening to The Big Soup. And we are back with episode 8, which is all about bringing back the love and looking for something real. And the phrase bring back the love came to me from two places. And the first one is to do with electronic music, dance, and club culture, shall we say. So I've always been massively into electronic music. I was entering into my teenage years in the late 90s, and there was so much great stuff there, and it was new, it was fresh. There was a sense of togetherness and connection and all of these wonderful things. And I can't remember who it was, but it was an actor who was saying that they went to Ibiza quite recently in the scheme of things, and they were comparing it back to like the 90s and early 2000s. And he said it was insane because back then there was a sense of connection, togetherness, community. There was love for one another. And now that's just missing because you go there, people are more bothered about like taking footage and pictures for social media. They want to be seen at the place rather than being in the place, which is a theme we will come back to over the course of this episode. But the point remains is that we have become so focused on ourselves that even when we go to places and events and experiences that are supposed to be about connection, it's all become about content. And I ask you this, my friends, are you content with your life, or is your life about content? The second place that this phrase, bring back the love, came from is when I lived in the warehouses in northeast London. There was a Caribbean takeaway just spitting distance from our front door that was called Bring Back the Love. And they brought us back to life many a time after a big weekend, I can tell you that. And I was very sad to see on a recent visit that the place is now long gone. Some good food. And there is a third place, not one, not two, but three places that this idea has come to me from. The third and final place is actually the most recent, in that I was doing a DJ set at one of my friend's birthdays 2 months ago at time of recording. Oh, how time flies. Something that I found quite interesting is that what I wanted to play was very well received. And there was a few folks who were saying, like, we need to hear more of this. We need more of this around the town. I was playing in Brighton. That's where my friend lives. And it just got me thinking. I was like, well, this place surely is all about love and acceptance and togetherness and, this melting pot of humanity. But even then, there is a lack of that sense of connection in some very specific aspects. So if you follow me on social media, you know that the Big Soup this week has gone through about 3 or 4 different revisions. There's now a complete episode of the Big Soup in my archive that I don't think will see the light of day because I'm not happy with it. Because this idea of bringing back the love is something that we really need to put at the forefront of so many of our endeavors in this world, because the world right now is all about disconnection, conflict, and destruction, and eroding the fabric that connects us together in our society, in our communities, to each other as human beings, and also the connections that we have with ourselves. So it is a big deal, I must say. And what is more human than love? I must say that. I mean, even though we see evidence of love in the animal kingdom, there is something distinctly warm about the expression and the feeling that we cannot lose, or it shall be at our peril. So this really set off a train of thought that's been sort of in and out the front and back of my mind for a long time now, because something that I've always been driven by is curiosity, a love and passion and enthusiasm for life and anything that I come into contact with, and all of these things. I'm a curious guy. I'm a very open-hearted guy, and to me, that's where I live from. It's all very much about chasing experiences and expanding the awareness and this kind of thing, and a love of life itself. So it's very difficult now when you go on social media and you look at people talking about like dating tips, for example. So much dating tips now revolve around the material and the financial, presenting them as if they are the be-all and end-all. And if you don't meet the grade of a certain bank balance, apparently you're not worthy as a person, and you need to go and grind yourself into a hole until you can roll up at your prospective date's house in a Lamborghini. money or something similar to that. We have internalized this bullshit to such a degree that we're mistaking the internalization of consumerist culture for human connection that is of value. Now, I find it interesting that so many of us in the world have become obsessed with the physical material, because the physical material is the beginning and the anchor for the human experience. It is not the end of the human experience. It is not the extent of the human experience. And if we were to judge our lives and each other and our experiences on these factors alone, we would be living pretty empty and vacuous lives. I can tell you that for free. So this brings us back to our old friend, the imaginary social hierarchy, and where people sit on the ladder of hierarchy and how you can use them to get ahead, which obviously is not something that I'm into. It's something that we need to recognize is a big cause of this culture. And then internalizing that, it lives within us and we uphold that as one, which is not a vibe, that's for sure. And I have met plenty of these people. I've had working relationships, personal relationships, romantic relationships with these kinds of people over the years who are just obsessed about climbing up that ladder so they can be seen for reasons unknown to me. And it's difficult because when someone is driven by these factors alone, they're fully in the service of their own unchecked and unintegrated ego. They don't realize that their desire to be seen in such a way is just rampant egotism for which everyone else pays the price. I am very open about not being interested in the social hierarchy and not being interested in climbing the ladder. But also when people meet me and there's the inevitable conversations about, oh, what do you do? What are you involved with? Blah, 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 blah. I always downplay it because as someone who works for themselves and is doing their own thing in this world, I am connected to a lot of interesting people doing a lot of cool shit. But to me, these people are my friends. It's not about what they do. It's about the fact that I enjoy being in their company and that I enjoy spending time with them. And I enjoy what tends to happen when we all get together, regardless of the setting or the sense of occasion. So it's interesting. When I think back over the years and in the various different jobs I've done and the communities I've moved through, and because I downplay things a little bit and I'm a bit secretive sometimes. It's just my nature. Not everyone needs to know everything about me straight up. I have noticed that people change their tune when I was involved with certain things. Like they would just kind of write me off as like some random dude, da 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 da. But then they'd be like, oh, yeah, Al's connected with those guys or he's involved in this. And then suddenly the tone would change towards me. Then they want to be my friend. They'd be very accommodating. Oh, would you like a drink? Do you want this? Kind of things. And to me, there was nothing more insulting. And I used to kind of play the game with them a little bit when I noticed this shift. And I thought, you don't really want to know me. You have identified that I can advance your position in some way. So you're now networking me to achieve your aims. And this was the funny thing, like when we were at music college as well, they taught us about networking. Bear in mind, I went into this when I was 19. So it was the first time I ever heard this term. Like, yeah, you got to network, you got to meet people, da, 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 all this kind of stuff. And I was like, well, I love talking to people. I love connecting with people. I love learning about people. And I'm always really curious about people. So networking and connection always came very naturally to me. It's not something that I had to try to do, but it was interesting to me that a lot of the time I just wanted to connect with people because I thought they were cool or there was something about them that was interesting. I wasn't really too bothered about how they could advance my cause. And inevitably, some people did, but that's because we had the relationship with each other already. It wasn't about, you can do this for me. So, no. So we see this playing out on a grand scale at the moment, that so many people out there are making all of these demands of like, I'm a high value person. I know my worth, all of this, that, da, 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 da. And the things that they're pointing to are entirely physical material and think that they can move through the social hierarchy through the abusive relationships, both personal, professional, romantic, the mistreatment of others, and seeing every other human being as a background character in their own story of which they have the starring role. I find this mad because it speaks to an obsession that we've developed as a society with people who carry this social currency. Who is it that you want to be seen with? Who's hot? Who's not? This kind of thing. And then you get folks like me who are just quite happy to be at the cool shit, but will melt into the background because it's about the experience. It's not about being seen at the experience. So when we lead with love, all of this stuff goes out of the window. Now, I was chatting with a friend who just got back from traveling a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying that she was taken aback about how in one of the countries she visited, there doesn't seem to be the social hierarchy in the same way that there is here. And in the UK, it's terrible. We are a country that is so far up its own ass, you would not believe. We have the ingrained class system. Everything is about hierarchy. Everything is about currency, and people are seen as stepping stones to get from one place to another. And she said it was really refreshing that people just seemed to want to know each other for who they were rather than what they did or what they were connected to. And it was nice to hear that, I must say. And even though, we can be like this individually, and we should be more like this as a collective at the moment, we are the exact opposite. And social media, influencer culture, the cults of personality, the cliques around people, and all of this kind of stuff is really cementing this for the digital age. And which I got to admit is quite troubling in many respects, because we are then misplacing our attention, misplacing our focus, and misplacing our efforts to try and climb this plastic ladder that's only going to melt in the heat as the world gets hotter anyway, because a lot of things we've been taught to value and aspire to are meaningless. And we are having a collective awakening to that at the moment. So when we are wrapped up in that physical experience in the material world, we end up finding ourselves bowing down at the temple of the plastic gods, which, we spoke a bit about this in the previous episode, the plastic or gold. So I'm not going to go over too much old ground, but it is worth to remember that when we don't have a higher sense of connection with ourselves and with each other, we will default to and revert to the plastic stuff because that's what we've had rammed down our throats for years. So there's this book about astrology, and if you've been following me for a while, you know that I'm into that. And so there's this particular book about astrology that I found quite interesting called Making the Gods Work for You by Caroline W. Casey. And it treats the planets as if they were gods and archetypes that essentially exist within us. And, I'm all for any kind of embodied practice. And this was I would say this was a key text for me really sort of understanding my own relationship with astrology. And there was this wonderful passage in it that I'm paraphrasing. Where the author said, in the absence of a higher connection with something like a God-style figure or energy in society, we end up worshipping the shadow inversions of such a thing. And we can see this very clearly in the culture of celebrity and how people rally around public figures and viewing political figures as some kind of God-given savior. All of this kind of total bollocks we're trying to fill the void of something higher with the most lowest possible energy, aspirations, manifestations that humanity can churn out. And we then again see this as part of that internalization process where people are doing everything they can to look, be, act a certain way so they then may be accepted and move themselves up the social hierarchy. But fact of it is, if we're thinking about the actual social hierarchy and how that works, people do not care for the nouveau riche energy, people who've suddenly come into money and then splashing it about everywhere, or people who give the illusion of that impression. This is particularly prescient to the online business world where people are marketing themselves based on lifestyles. And you can do it too, but you actually can't if you do it learning from them and you're just funding their lifestyle rather than their advice. But what we don't recognize is that when we're unconsciously motivated and very consciously choosing to jump through these hoops, the actual social hierarchy is still out of reach, because those who are in that hierarchy will just see this kind of thing as trash. They won't let you ascend up through the ladder. So I'm saying, let's do away with it. Let's put it out of our consciousness and let's actually focus on human connection between one another. Because when we recognize that every human has meaning and value and purpose to them, we recognize that everyone is carrying a perspective and an essence and a fingerprint, that when we connect with people based on that level, that can be the groundwork for very meaningful connections and relationships. If you're connecting with people just because you like their vibe and want to be around that more, that's fine. If you're connecting with people based on how you feel when you're around them, or you mutually enjoy each other's company, that's also great as well. There's so many things here that it doesn't take much for us to flip that switch of focus and recognize that we can take a different course and a different approach when it comes to how we engage with others and the world. When we see groups that are bonded in negativity, fear, hatred, outrage, and the suppression of others to make themselves feel good, this is as plastic as it gets. And I have had plenty of experiences in my professional and personal life of these kinds of circles. The bonding factors of the group are not positive, or they're not mutually empowering or mutually supportive, but they're all kind of bonded through scar tissue and wounds that gives this impression of yeah, this is my soul fam, or this is my crew. But really, that scar tissue has just knitted together and it's impossible to escape. And then when you actually start to heal from those things, you have to rip yourself away, and then you give yourself another round of healing as a result. So there is some real dangerous, sticky situations that we can find ourselves in if we're not mindful about the nature of what drives our connection with others and drives our desire to imprint ourselves on the world and leave a mark in some way or another. So it's not like we have to go out there and do something drastic. We actually just have to make these subtle shifts. And when we start to do that for ourselves, we start to recognize that we've become so disconnected from our emotions that people are telling us what to think, people are telling us what to feel. And then when we start to tune back into that and get an awareness of ourselves, we then start to see this kind of thing for what it is, which is a manipulation. So when we start to become conscious of the manipulations, we start to free ourselves from this constant tennis match of nonsense, of primal emotions and being driven by others to do things that they want us to do because they have vested interest. It's no secret that populism is on the rise in our world. And, I don't have time for the populists. I think they're idiots. And I think that they are abusers and they are taking everyone that supports them for a ride. Unless, of course, some of those supporters are trying to recast themselves in their own image, then, this content is not for them because they don't matter. They're on a hiding to nothing and on the road to a very dark place as the world evolves and expands and integrates further with different peoples and cultures and viewpoints. But what we have to recognize here is when we start to move through the sense of emotional manipulation through connection with others, we open ourselves up to more meaningful and positive connections. And this can be quite troubling because I don't know, if you're listening to this, if you've gone through a similar experience, when you have that moment of perspective shift, it then can become quite isolating. Because you're pulling yourself away from so many things that you've known, you are coming back to ground within yourself. And then from there, you're setting out to move forwards again in a different but more aligned direction. So there's a few different things at play that we need to be mindful of. But when we recognize that, people like public figures, political figures, all of this kind of stuff, they really don't have our interests like the regular folks out there, boots on the ground, there in the world. All they want is our energy, our time, our attention, our money, our ticking in the box next to their name in whatever various different election scenario we're involved in with them. So there's so many things that are purely there to manipulate us because we have become disconnected from that sense of love for ourselves, love for one another, love for society, love for the planet. And it's very telling that we live in a time where people are now pushing back on things like empathy. Empathy is one of the most basic human emotional states and awarenesses and understanding, your ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, your ability to relate to them through what they may or may not be going through at that time, your ability to connect with each other's through shared viewpoints. And then people who have the audacity to claim that empathy is somehow toxic then have the audacity to act like they are the victim when people push back on their absolute nonsense. So we need to see through this, and people who are making that kind of rules for thee but not for me mentality do not deserve our time, attention, or the platform that they have positioned themselves on. Another thing that I was watching a few days ago about populism and how to essentially combat it, or at least act as the antidote towards it, was to focus more on community. And if we, for example, in the UK, if we look at how our social fabric has been eroded away for decades, sold off to the highest bidder, supposedly the private sector will replace things that have been taken away by the public sector or the state. It just doesn't happen. When things are taken away, they don't come back, because that's not how things work. Because things that are supportive of society and supportive of communities are not necessarily profit-making enterprises. And if it's not a profit-making enterprise, then the private sector is least likely to get involved. So we see that on one side, and then with the rise of social media and the app-based internet, we've become so isolated from each other because we don't have these community spaces. We don't have these third spaces. A third space is a space that is not your residency or your place of work, somewhere for people to congregate. We're staring down the barrel of a very challenging framework that only serves to keep us more isolated, disconnected, and then ultimately marching to the beat of someone's drum who claims to understand us but just wants to manipulate us and put themselves above us. So there's a whole thing here that when we start to pull this apart, community, connection, love, appreciation, understanding for one another is the key. One of the things that I thought was really beautiful during the pandemonium of 2020 and so forth were the mutual aid groups that were set up. Suddenly every street had a WhatsApp group, or every neighborhood had a WhatsApp group where people would check in on each other, see if there's anything that anyone needed, all of this kind of stuff, all rolling along. And there was a moment there where we had a possibility to turn a corner before the smooth brains kicked off and started to freak out because they were being asked to do things that might benefit other people. We had an opportunity to ascend in consciousness as a society, but that was effectively, to many degrees, torpedoed by a bunch of folks who couldn't handle the fact that they were being asked to care about other people. So one of the reasons I feel quite strongly about that is this was very evident in the spiritual community. People claiming to be awake, but they're just high on the smell of their own ass. And no one was challenging them on this because supposedly everyone's opinion is now their truth, and you can't challenge a truth because a truth by nature is infallible, but the truth itself will stand up to facts and scrutiny and questioning. But then people have a level 10 freak out and crash out because they don't have the inner structure and awareness, the emotional structure and framework to meet with a logical and rational challenge to their perspective that they have labeled as the truth. And so the dance has gone around for a few years now, and when people can't handle something contradictory, they call it fake. Where is the love in that environment? Where is the love? Because without accountability, there can be no love. With looking at the world extractively and what it can do for you and your own gratifications, there can't be any love for that, because you don't have any love for anything or anyone else. The only love you have is for feeding your own sense of station in the world. And it brings us back to egotism. There's a few things here that are quite troubling that really underline this sense that we need to get back to something real in this world. We need to find a way to a place of balanced perspective and connection with one another that doesn't descend into a conflict at the drop of a hat. Because again, without this sense of meaningful connection and understanding with others, we then get locked into our own echo chambers and only hang out with people that validate us, only associate with people that share views. Humanity is like a garden, and any garden is, in a sense, an ecosystem. And in an ecosystem, there needs to be biodiversity for it to thrive. So humanity needs a diversity of perspectives, of people, of cultures, of ideas, of thoughts, of visions, not just to survive, but to thrive as well as we go forward into an as yet unwritten future. And because we're living in this fast-paced cycle driven by emotional manipulation and total dysregulation, people have now come to this idea that everything needs to be instant access. It's the fast food mentality applied to all aspects of life. But how many times you go to a fast food place and then you're either hungry quite shortly after, or your stomach feels like lead because you've just ingested a bunch of mass-produced crap. So when we put the lens of connection with one another through that, that is a very sticky landscape to be in. And if we were going to use food as an analogy, what is the best food for you? Is it the thing that's been slow cooked gently over a few hours, or the thing that you shove in the microwave to just fill you up and satiate your hunger? We need something deeper. We need something more meaningful. And love as an energy is something that takes time to grow, to blossom, to bloom, and produce its fruits. As someone who works in the spirituality world, readings is basically the bread and butter if you're self-employed like I am. And a lot of times when people come to me for readings, my heart sinks because the questions that they're asking me could be remedied with a bit of patience and a bit of perspective. And of course, it's my job to support and serve them. And one of the platforms that I work on doing this stuff, you've got no idea what someone's going to ask you until like the notification goes up and then they roll up into your inbox with the request for your insights. And sadly, when it comes to relationships and connections with others, you've got people freaking out because their person didn't speak to them for 24 hours. You've got people freaking out because they only saw their person once in the past week. We're not appreciating life in a larger context because we expect everything to be instant access and immediately available to us at any one time. And then if that's not the case, something must be a problem. And the rot at the heart of this mentality is individualism. The idea that supposedly we don't need one another, we don't need our environment, we don't need to tend to our communities, and everything is there to serve us or serve the protected group or whatever nonsense people are feeding themselves. Whereas if we recognize like the interdependent nature between people, things, places, stuff, the world, all of these things, we start to see that there are different rhythms in life. There are different flows in life. Life itself has a breathing process. And, anything that is alive needs to breathe in a manner of speaking. And you aren't just breathing in and out. There is space between those breaths as well. Space to percolate, space to integrate, space to reflect, particularly if we're using this as an analogy for connection. And I always try to guide people towards an empowered perspective, try to help them sort of out of the hole that they found themselves in and really support their agency at all times. And I would say 97% of the time, people are receptive to that because they want to feel better. They want to feel good. They want to feel heard and seen. 3% of the time, you have people expecting you to wave a magic wand and solve the problems for them. That's just not how it works. And it's also unethical as well because it's disempowering them. But that's where this way of looking at the world has got us. That's where this way of living and being has gotten us. That if something has not happened exactly as you expect it to, then there must be a problem with you personally. This is so much unnecessary pressure that we're putting on ourselves. This is so much unnecessary pain that we are inflicting on ourselves. And there's so many unnecessary headaches for all parties involved in any of these situations. So even though we are the most connected we've ever been, even though we've got the ability to connect with someone on the other side of the planet instantly, we are the loneliest and the most disconnected and the most frustrated. And that's a shame. And that's why, for me, if we're going to put anything out into the world, it needs to be about positivity or something that is stirring positivity or good focus or finding the good in things amidst the nonsense that is at play in the world. It's not about bypassing. It's not about pretending that things don't exist. It's about finding your way within it all. And one of the difficult things about that is when people fall into that sense of disconnection and ultimately that loneliness, because we are social creatures, we are collective beings, we are pack animals, and the sense of isolation is not natural, and it plays on that primal fear of survival as well, because when you are pushed out of the group for whatever reason or not part of a group, then primarily we are conditioned to believe that something is a threat to our survival because we've survived in community all of this long. We then unfortunately see people turning that back out on the world. If they've not done the work, if they're not conscious of themselves, if they have this entitled mentality or this attitude that everything is there to service them, they turn that pain back out on others because they felt it, so therefore others may suffer as well. That's not the vibe, is it? That's like a parental figure saying, oh, well, this happened to me and I was fine, so they'll be fine as well. That's not the way it works. Like I remember my stepmom saying to me, well, I moved out at 16 and I turned out fine, so you'll be fine as well. And of course, then being kicked out of home at such a young age, I was not fine for a long time. I did have a chip on my shoulder and was very frustrated, lots of pain that I then, of course, without meaning to, turned around on those people around me. And I still regret that to this day. I've atoned for that. I've made amends with everyone that I can. But the bottom line is, if we don't know how the cycle is living through us, we don't know how to break the cycle. And there are many ways for those who have felt that pain to inflict that pain on others, whether they mean to or not, consciously or unconsciously. The bottom line is, if we're not leading with love, it's difficult for us to have that awareness. So we have to love ourselves for starters. And so much of society has been set up where we are encouraged to hate ourselves. The idea that we need to go to religion to experience God's love, because if we don't experience God's love, we're going to go to hell. What kind of being would send you to hell if they supposedly loved you? It is one of the greatest hypocrisies of all time. We have the beauty, well-being industries thriving on making people feel crap about themselves, so they then fall over to get this next product that will tip them into a state of ecstasy and a self-concept that is bulletproof until the next thing comes along. All of our world is set up for us to be opposed to this idea of self-love, self-appreciation. And supposedly, if you do love yourself, if you do take care of yourself, if you do have strong boundaries, then supposedly there's something wrong with you, or you're mean or selfish or delusional. It's total bollocks. Because at the end of the day, someone who can find love for themselves and build a foundation and a platform from that space and that place in this climate, I take my hat off to them. You know, I salute that. I respect that, because that is not easy. It is very empowering, but also quite challenging when we recognize that others will then look down on that because they are not happy with themselves. Something that has been really freeing for me as a recovering people pleaser is recognizing that I'm not responsible for the versions of me that exist in the minds of others. You know, everyone's going to have an opinion on you, everyone's going to have a perspective on you, but I don't care. That's their issue. That's not my problem. Because since I started taking accountability for my own self and really trying to work on myself in a deep and meaningful way, so I could move through the world as me, as the version of me that I want to be, stuff like this has bothered me a lot less. And when we lead with that love, we start to appreciate ourselves in a way that we're accepting of the things that have maybe been told as undesirable. You know, shadow work is a big conversation now, but shadow work really is about integrating those parts of ourselves that have been labeled undesirable, or those parts of ourselves that were there for when we needed to survive. And then we don't need them afterwards, but we still carry those aspects, those behaviors, those perspectives, these various different things. So it's important to lead with that self-compassion for yourself. You know, it's important to recognize that we are evolving beings. We are processes. We're not products. No one is the finished article. The day you're the finished article is the day you die. There's nothing less to learn. There's nowhere left to grow. And then we go on to whatever the next thing is, the next energetic experience, the next dimension or whatever. I don't know. I've not been there, so I'm speculating. But to me, the idea of humanity as a school, as a place of learning, always really appealed to me. And I think it's really time that we started to learn to lead with love. And I don't care what people say, if they're like, oh yeah, nah, 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 or, you know, try and dunk on that. Screw them. Rarely had a negative opinion come from someone about me, my perspective, my ideas that I respected. You know, people out there calling this kind of thing cringe tend to lead lonely and miserable lives. They cannot find joy for others because they can't find joy in their own lives. So we see there is a pattern here. Misery begets misery. And like they say in Star Wars, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And to me, this is fascinating, because how many groups, ideologies, things in the world are bonded by exactly these factors. You know, when we recognize that for what it is, we can see where the shadow of humanity has managed to get itself a foothold to try and sustain its own existence, going through this extinction burst as it goes into the long night forever. Or at least if the rest of us have our way. So this is not something to be afraid of. You know, these are things that we can make very subtle shifts, and things that when we recognize we're connecting with positivity, positive experiences, the positive aspects of one another, these then become expansive. I've always believed in seeking common ground with people. You know, not everyone's up for that, but if they're not up for that, that's not my problem. But the ones who are have always led to very meaningful and enriching and nourishing relationships and connections. So we need to recognize that love is a transcendental force, and transcendental of our circumstances and our experiences and our society, because it's bigger than us. It's universal. You know, so we need to connect with that. We need to find ways to let that in, to express ourselves, to be joyful, to be light, to be free. It all starts with us as individuals. You know, it all starts with that flipping the switch of perspective and starting to work out from there. It may sound straightforward, but it's not necessarily easy, and that's the real challenge here. So I dare you, my friends, my souplings, the soup crew, the soup gang, to find a way to lead with love, to try and find a way to educate yourself on maybe a perspective that is confusing to you, to understand how someone from a different culture lives, to get into something that might be outside of your normal zone of operations. You know, we are curious beings, and that curiosity is steadily eroded away by the various different mechanisms and people in life that have a vested interest to have power, control, dominance, and and restrict, repress and oppress. So if we want to have our agency back in this day and age, it's all about connecting with the love, man. And love brings us to more meaningful connections with ourselves, more meaningful connections with others, and a deeper reality within the human experience. So get creative, get curious, get out there. Lead with that energy. Just because everyone else is disappearing into the shadow of their own bums doesn't mean you have to as well. It is never too late to make a change. It's never too late to turn a corner, because that's the trip a lot of us are on, and that tide is rising and raising up all the boats with it as well. You don't really want to be chained to the ocean floor when that thing starts going up, let me tell you. All right, my friends, that's it for this week. And when we focus on bringing back the love, we give ourselves a chance to connect with something that is real in this world, not that is plastic, not that is there to try and stand over us for us to aspire to, when it has the energetic equivalent of a used tube sock, if you know what I'm saying. So, my name is Alistair Ballantyne. If you want my help, assistance, and support on your personal journey of development, spiritual awareness, awakening, and well-being, please feel free to head over to my website, www.alistairballantyne.com, and see how I can be of service to you, because it is my mission to walk beside you as a spiritual friend who has walked this landscape a number of different times and routes, and has got some various different ways that I can help you expand in yourself. And I'm always here to support the agency and autonomy of others. I'm not here to be your guru. I'm not here to be the gatekeeper. I'm just here to shine my light so you can recognize the light in you and shine your light into this world and connect with the things that you want to do and realize your visions. Thanks again for tuning in. We shall see you next time. And until then, stay soupy, stay curious.